This is the Author Archive podcast. I'm David Freeman. Guest today is Andrew Lownie, who has written The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. That's a very tabloid title, Andrew. Was he really a traitor?
Yes, I didn't put a question mark on it because the evidence I found in primary archives is that he wasn't an innocent dupe of the Nazis. He actually actively intrigued with them. We know this from a whole series of sources, including captured German documents, which chart the communications between the various ambassadors and the foreign minister in Berlin, talking about their conversations with him, how he'd exhorted them to bomb London in order to subjugate Britain. And this is backed up with diary entries from people like the King's private secretary and MI5 officers who are monitoring these communications and deciding how to respond to them.
Now, this is the man who was king for a few days. He's the present Queen's uncle. What happened then? Did it all fall apart because he met this woman, Wallis Simpson?
No, I think he was pretty pro-German and pretty pro-Nazi even before he came to the throne in January 1936. One of the concerns amongst the courtiers and the government officials was that he was going outside his constitutional role and trying to get involved in politics. He'd interfered with the Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935. As the king in March 1936, he'd played down the remilitarization of the Rhineland. So there were real concerns that he was getting too close to the Nazis. Wallis herself was quite close, who's supposed to be a lover of von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador. But the concerns were there long before he abdicated in December 1936, or he came to the throne in January.
Was there any part of this that was informed by his Germanness? Somewhere in the book, you say if you go back to grandparents, great-great-grandparents, the majority of them were German.
Yes, I mean, his mother was German. He was 14th, 16th German. He spoke fluent German. He'd spent a lot of his youth in Germany. He was very close to German cousins who were Nazi generals like Prince Philip of Hesse and the Duke of Saxe-Coburg. So, and he was a great believer in firm government. He felt that the Anglo-Saxon nations, Germany and Britain, should stand together against communist Russia.
Do we have anything to learn from this 80, 90 years on?
Well, I think there are very interesting similarities with the Harry and Meghan case. I mean, here we have a young, charismatic prince who marries an American divorcee, goes into exile, is separated from his friends and family, blames his family for the problems he's got, falls out with his brother and his sister-in-law. There are debates about finances and security, an attempt to curate the story, suing of the press, abuse of the royal links for commercial gain. So the playbook's there for Harry and Meghan. I think the problem is in a less deferential society with social media. It's and with I have to say, a rather more sophisticated American divorcee than Wallis. It's very difficult to know how to respond. What they did before was freeze him out, and that's what they're doing with Harry.
Was it easier to do in the 1930s than it is now?
Yes, there was. I mean, the press here was prepared to basically support the establishment, so there was very little coverage of the Wallis case. They did the sort of bidding of the establishment. And of course, stuff appeared in the States and Australia, but no one here saw those papers, whereas now with the internet, everyone would. So yes, it's a much more difficult situation now than then.
I have read this story over the years in other books. For your book, did you have access to material that other earlier authors didn't have?
Yes, I mean, I always rely on primary sources. There's material from Freedom Information requests. I found a lot of material in the Bahamas archives. There's material from German, Spanish, Russian archives, private archives in the States, diaries which have only just become available. I had access to the Royal Archives, who opened the file on Edward VIII to me as the first researcher since the official biographer Philip Ziegler 40 years ago. So it's all new. What's interesting is the stuff that has been there in the archives. For example, Churchill threatening to court-martial the Duke in July 1940, and these captured German documents. Historians have been able to look at those for years, but I think most people who write about royal history are pretty deferential. They rely on sort of their royal sources, and they're not going to upset them. And I think someone who comes as an outsider like me, who is perhaps a bit more independent, is the way things are now going.
When you wrote the book and you got this new information, were there things that made your jaw drop and even you went, goodness me?
Yes, I mean, lots of times.
Yes.
I mean, the Traitor King accusation, I didn't believe that he would communicate with the enemy in code during the war. I didn't think that he would exhort them to bomb Britain, including killing his brother. I didn't, all the complicated sex lives, the fact that they had basically a pimp in Hollywood who was finding lovers of both sexes for them, all this was shocking to me and not what was part of the conventional story.
I mean, just on a very surface level, putting aside the sex and everything, as someone who is negotiating with EasyJet to go to the UK, to go to Europe at the moment, these guys never traveled light. They wouldn't have got anywhere. They travel with sort of 71 items of luggage.
Yes, it becomes a sort of motif of the book. I mean, even when they were brought back to Britain at the beginning of the war, they refused to get on the plane because it wouldn't take their luggage. They had to have a destroyer. And I mean, the stories in the press of there was so much luggage that they had to store it in the corridors because it wouldn't fit in their suite. And even poor old Lady Halifax, who was the wife of the ambassador in Washington, was shocked that to transfer their luggage from the railway station to the embassy, they actually hired a lorry to carry it.
I mean, one wonders, A, what they were carrying around with them, and B, much more probably potently, was who was paying for all of this? Because what comes out of your book is, yes, he'd been king, yes, he wasn't king anymore, but he really didn't like paying for anything.
No, he intended to live exactly as he had been as king. I mean, he liked rich Americans and sponged off them. They paid the bills. In that case, with the lorry going to the embassy, he just sent the bill to the Halifaxes. When he stayed with people and ran up huge bills, he just assumed that they would pay them. Even his poor ADC was forced to pick up the bills sometimes at restaurants because he just pretended not to have any money. They were very, very mean. I mean, they lived very extravagantly. They had a staff of 37, 3 chauffeurs, but they didn't pay them the going rate. They treated them very badly, and people rarely stayed. I mean, they didn't have a great deal. People didn't have a great deal of loyalty to them, and vice versa.
I mean, how do they justify it? I mean, have you got any idea what was going on in their brains and hearts that they could justify sponging off people, living like this, just taking, if it's going, I'll have it. I mean, it sounds like they were horrible.
Well, they were pretty horrible people, and that's how they sort of got on so well together. He had been brought up to, in a sense, expect this as a member of the royal family. He felt very self-entitled. You see shades of Prince Andrew there. She had had a pretty sort of genteel poverty background, upbringing. Her father had died when she was 6 months old, and she was just desperate for financial security, and he provided it. And she just sort of piggybacked off him. And, you know, people swarmed around them, were happy to pick up the bills, sucked up to them, thought they were important. I mean, they were the most boring people. There was no inner life. It was a very superficial cafe society life. But there were enough hangers-on who were prepared to pay the bills and liked being with the royals. I suspect it still goes on.
It's still the same, yes. Because someone said, you've got a lovely story saying that he was like a prince in a fairy tale. He got everything but a soul, that people, music, art, books, ideas just meant nothing.
No, exactly. And I think that's a very crucial quote. We use it in the documentary that came out on Channel 4 a few weeks ago. And I think that really does sum him up. There was no center to him. It was a completely superficial life. I mean, they liked dressing well. They were always voted best dressed in the year. They liked entertaining. They were very trivial, superficial people.
Now, a long time ago, when I was delving in this particular historical bucket, someone said to me, you know, Wallace was a man. She was not a beautiful woman. There was something odd about her. I sort of tremulously ask, was there something odd about her?
Yes, I mean, people described her like a playing card, which is very thin. She, as you say, wasn't at all good looking. I mean, people have suggested that she was a hermaphrodite, all sorts of stories. But I mean, clearly, I just don't know. We haven't got medical reports. She probably had an abortion, and as a result of that, couldn't have children. He possibly had several illegitimate children before, and indeed even when he was with Wallace. There's one still alive called Tim Seeley, an actor, who was born in 1935. But it was a very odd sex life. Some people say the marriage was never consummated. Others say that she had learnt all sorts of tricks in China, in the brothels there, and that's what kept him happy. It was certainly a very sadomasochistic relationship. She felt trapped in this relationship, resented it, took it out on him, was incredibly cruel and controlling. But the more unpleasant she was to him, the more he liked it.
I mean, that is just weird, isn't it? I mean, there's another story of him going off with a male mate, and he's really convivial and he's good company. And then they come back to where she is, and he just clams up and becomes something completely different. So was he terrified of her?
Yes, I think he was. I mean, he was looking for a mother figure. All his girlfriends had been sort of substitute mothers. He had a very cold mother, Queen Mary. But I think that's a very good example of in a sense these how he was torn between these two worlds. I mean, and I think possibly if he hadn't married Wallace and married someone who was rather nicer, he might have been a very different character. I mean, again, you can see shades of Harry. But I think that's very interesting. It comes from Fruity Metcalf's wife. Fruity Metcalf was his ADC and great friend and possible lover. And Barbara Metcalf has a very incisive diary which makes these points. And in fact, the letters between Fruity and Barbara are very revealing. So we have, lots of good sources on his behavior. It's not speculation.
I mean, that's another thing. You talked to me, Andrew, about Fruity and Barbara. I mean, the names are straight out of Noel Coward, aren't they? Or, some opera or some skit of the time that
Yes,
these people, I mean, hi, Fruity. I mean,
it could be almost like a pastiche, exactly.
Yes.
It is a different world. You've got to remember they were born in the 19th century, and they, in a sense, their formative years were the 1920s and 30s. And that is the circles they mixed in. Polo playing, hunting, balls and country house weekends. That was the world that they knew.
Well, I mean, even Prince Andrew said, "Oh, it was just a normal shooting weekend." I mean, for most of us, I mean, it still lives on, doesn't it?
Yes. The royal family are different, certainly, and I mean, and that's part of the part of the mystique, that they are different. And I think this is one of the challenges, how do they come to our level so that people can identify with them, but also admire them and feel that they are special?
Has your attitude changed I mean, the book is a terrific read and you've managed to make it into a page turner. Did your attitudes change during the writing process?
Yes. I mean, you've got to make people sympathetic, otherwise people aren't going to read about them. So I do specialize in rogues. I did a spy before, and the Mountbattens, who had this very racy private life. But the Mountbattens, had a tradition of public service. There were lots and lots of things that one could admire about them. There was very little I could admire about the Windsors. And so I did, my respect for them fell, particularly when stories came out about how they treated their staff. And I think the other thing that changed was my view of the establishment, that the establishment will cover up these people. These captured German documents, which showed just how treacherous he'd been to this country during the Second World War, were suppressed by Churchill. Some of them were destroyed. And this attempt to basically cover up the sins of the royal family and others by the establishment, I found very shocking.
The relationship with the Nazis, was that fueled and impelled from the German side, or was it from him as well?
Well, no, the pressure came from the Germans, but they knew they were pushing at an open door. They knew that he was a great supporter of Hitler. He had broadcast to Hitler just before the war. There was actually stories that Hitler had sent him a wedding present.
Yes, you said a gold box. So
yes.
At the wedding, they had something from Winston Churchill and something from Hitler.
I mean, they were playing both sides, and I mean, of course, Churchill fell out with him and refused to go on a cruise with him after the war because of his behaviour. But no, the Germans realized that he could be a very useful ally. They were very disappointed by the abdication because they'd hoped that they could work with him. And it's very interesting to speculate what might have happened. You know, if he had remained king, you know, we wouldn't have had Churchill probably. We would have had maybe Halifax. We may not have had a German declaration of war. We wouldn't have declared war against Germany. There would have been some sort of negotiated peace even before 1939. Hitler may have succeeded in defeating the Soviet Union, and we would now be living in a German state. So it's fascinating to think what might have happened.
Because he was also an anti-Semite, wasn't he?
Yes, right to the end of his life. And I think that's one of the really chilling things. You know, what would have happened to anyone who was Jewish if he had been in power? And he remained, even after the concentration camps and the Holocaust, he remained an unrepentant anti-Semite.
Was there a feeling, just stepping back a bit, was there a feeling in UK management circles in the government, oh, goodness me, what are we going to do with this guy? And they sent him off to be a governor in a far distant island.
I mean, there have been concerns about him from a very early stage, even before he became king. Baldwin, the Prime Minister, and Tommy Lascelles, the King's private secretary, prayed each day he'd be killed steeplechasing. The abdication, in a sense, saved them, because Wallace came along. They used that as a device to get him off the throne. And as you say, the only way to control him was, and the danger that he would come back as a puppet king in 1940, was to appoint him as governor of the Bahamas, a long way away from Europe, so that he could be kept quiet. But even then he created mischief. He was in touch with isolationists in America, saying to them that there was no reason for America to come into the war. So he was troublesome wherever he was.
And there was a murder. Now, was he actually involved in that murder?
Yes, this is a famous unsolved murder case called the Harry Oates case. Probably the richest man in the Bahamas was murdered in July 1943. I don't think the king was involved, or the former king was involved, but he certainly was involved in a cover-up. He was responsible for investigating the case, and he brought in two crooked cops from Miami, from the FBI, rather than bring in Scotland Yard. He posted the commissioner of police to a neighboring island, so he couldn't deal with it. A man who could have been trusted to do it dispassionately. He was involved, I think, with both Harry Oates and the man who I believe ordered the murder, a man called Harold Christie, in a financial syndicate where they were taking money and taking it off to Mexico against currency regulations. And I think also he wanted to solve this murder as quickly as possible, even if it meant framing an innocent man, Harry Oates' son-in-law, because it was bad for tourism. And Harold Christie was a very powerful figure on the executive committee of the administration, and he just wanted to shut the story down as quickly as possible and control it.
Just before we finish, who was bankrolling this? Now, was he a pauper or was he rich? And if he was rich, where did the money come from?
He was extremely rich, and he was rich really from his time as Prince of Wales, where he'd been taking money from the Duchy of Cornwall estates and not making clear that he had that money. And there was a great deal of resentment when the abdication came along, because he was trying to get an annuity from George VI, and then George VI discovered he didn't need it. But he made money from endorsing products like linen and crockery. He charged for interviews. He had insider dealing with a lot of crooked American businessmen. They sponged off people, so they very rarely paid for anything at their holidays. They even got subsidized or free travel across the Atlantic in return for a bit of publicity for the cruise liner. So they knew how to use their status to basically get freebies. And
final question. If we hadn't had the traitor king who stepped down and lived this tawdry and scurrilous life with vast numbers of footmen. I mean, we live without the footmen. I'm not quite sure what the footmen do, but is the best thing that he did for us make it possible for us to have Queen Elizabeth II?
Yes, I mean, clearly he probably wouldn't have had children as king, so she would have inherited, but she would have inherited in 1972 rather than in 1952. So we were celebrating a 50-year reign, not a 70-year reign now.
Andrew, it's a fabulous read. Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Andrew Lownie, I know you're now going off to America. Will they be interested?
Yes, the book's coming out. I'm doing some talks, in fact, tomorrow and Friday in New York. I'm doing further research in America in archives that were closed during COVID. So I'm hoping that there will be more disclosures, maybe an update of the book, and I hope maybe we can talk about it again another time.
I would love to. If you see any passing Americans that would like to watch this conversation, please point them in this direction. Absolutely superb to talk to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Nice to talk to you too. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.